Howdy. I was talking about Jordan Peterson the other day because I guess I enjoy my mind being at constant battle with the concept of peace and tranquility and happiness. It kind of got me thinking about his transphobic rhetoric because that's kind of like his whole thing. I feel like a lot of people often try to say that being transgender or the trans issue is a new thing that's kind of come about within more modern generations. And I was thinking about that and I was like, wow, that's really wrong and not true. So I wanted to talk about it because that's a big thing that people say and pull on when they're trying to put down trans people. My area of interest and my area of expertise in the archaeological field is ancient Greece. So in regards to Greek mythology, there are lots and lots of stories that focus on a gender change, men becoming women becoming men, etc. These stories reflect the culture that they were created in. So clearly the concept of gender change was accepted and understood by the ancient Greeks. It was also a concept that discussed a lot of things like the dangers that men pose to women and the curious nature of women in a society that did not understand them. Due to the nature of the male-centric ancient Greek society, so many women's stories often go unheard, unnoticed, unspoken. So it's almost like Greek myths which deal with gender change are a way for men to rationalize their ideas about women and what they thought women were within their own context, because they couldn't just go ask a woman like, hey, what's up, what do you think about the world and what are you doing and blah blah blah, because they didn't care about women enough. But they still knew that these people constituted half of their entire society, so they had these ideas about women, but the way that they would tell them was through their own context, which sometimes involved trans women. So a lot of the ideas and stories we have about this gender change concept are present in Ovid's Metamorphosis. And specifically, I want to look at book 9, which is my one of my absolute favorite pieces of historical literature ever. This is so beautiful. Okay. Essentially, in book 9 of Ovid's Metamorphosis, Ovid details the story of a girl called Iphis. And she's such a babe. So Iphis was a Cretan girl, but she was raised as a boy, essentially because when her mum fell pregnant, her dad was like, hey, if you don't bear me a son, I'm going to kill you. Anyway, Iphis's mum does give birth to a girl. She's like, well, shit, this is not good. He's going to kill me and he's going to kill my baby. So she disguised Iphis as a boy and raised her as a boy for her entire life. Then at the age of 13, Iphis is engaged to Ianthe, another woman. And Iphis falls madly in love with Ianthe, but she's really conflicted because they're both women and that was really taboo. You couldn't have, a woman could not marry a woman in ancient Greece. What the hell are you talking about? She prays to the gods and she asks the gods to make her a boy. She actually begs the god Isis to transform her into a boy, and Isis does this. And then Iphis and Ianthe live happily ever after. They get married. So Iphis becomes a man to fulfill his love with Ianthe. In ancient Greek myth, young boys are often described with a sense of sexual ambiguity. Their sexuality is very fluid. It's like they're often described as feminine, slight, and this is often to praise them. And this actually works in Iphis's favor. The feminine beauty of Iphis isn't seen as a detriment to her disguise. It's seen as a quality that is revered in a young boy. Despite this, it is clear in the myth that Iphis wants to marry Ianthe as a bride herself. But this was way outside of the acceptable binaries of this time. You're often kind of just like, oh yeah, the ancient Greeks, those guys were all gay. This isn't exactly false. It was definitely gay in more ways than one. But in terms of homosexuality in regards to women, forget about it. Forget about it. I personally think that the story between Iphis and Ianthe is a rationalization of female homosexuality in ancient Greece. Male homosexual relationships were really widely understood and widely expected in ancient Greece, but the idea that a woman could also have a same-sex relationship was very, very taboo. For me, this story is almost like a kind of rationalization of things that men might have seen going on between women, and they were like, what are you guys doing? What is that? While male homosexuality was commonplace in Greece, female homosexuality was considered unnatural. Ovid says so in his Metamorphosis. He says, mares do not burn with love for mares, or heifers for heifers. The ram inflames the ewe. Its hind follows the stag. So birds mate, and among all animals, not one female is attacked by lust for a female. So women's sexuality was invisible to these male-enforced binaries. Men were like, I can like women, and I can like men. Women can't like anybody. Women, what is that? If I'm not the center of lust and attraction, then that is unnatural. Because of this lack of understanding and lack of care for women's sexualities, the idea of lesbianism goes completely unnoticed, except for very, very few pieces that we get, like the story of Iphis and Ianthe and Sappho. Despite its taboo, in ancient Greece, women still would have had relationships with other women. And this myth of Iphis and Ianthe is a way for the general public to understand these relationships from a patriarchal point of view, in which a relationship cannot be fulfilled without a man. So that's my little story about lesbianism in ancient Greece. But if we look towards Hesiod, we can actually see a story of transness in its own right as well. We do have another example of a woman being turned into a man in Greek mythology, and this comes from Hesiod. In his little book, he describes the myth of Canaeus. Born as a daughter to King Aletus, she was known around Greece for her beauty. She was stunning, she was amazing, she was gorgeous, but she refused to marry. One night she was walking along the beach and Poseidon came up from the ocean and raped her. And then he granted her a wish because, that's just what the gods did back then. Yeah, the gods were not good people. They all sucked. The idea of God that we have now is like this wonderful creator who loves all of his creations. The gods in ancient Greece, they were just there to cause chaos. Anyway, so he grants her a wish and she's like, I want to be a boy. And she says this because then she will not have to live in fear of men. And so he grants her this wish, and then Canaeus lives out the rest of his life canaeus, and he became a man protected from all wounds. So to me, it feels like the significance of canaeus becoming canaeus is symbolic of the context of female inferiority in ancient Greece. Women were regarded as lower order beings on the whole, and it's because of this disadvantaged position that they held in society that, not unlike today, they were faced with a lot of dangers inflicted by men. So it's obvious that the men who enforced these patriarchal ideals also were aware of the negative effects they had on women. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, we actually get a line from Canaeus which says, "This injury evokes the great desire never to be able to suffer any such again. Grant I might not be a woman, you will have given me everything." What I think is really cool is that in this moment when Canaeus becomes canaeus, I'm sure there are better ways to be pronouncing that, it's reflected in the literature. So if we look at Ovid's Metamorphosis, when Canaeus is female, it's written in the form of an elegy. Then it turns into an epic when he transforms into a man. The idea of the epic really denotes masculinity and power. You don't have just a transformation in the story, you have a transformation of the literature that you're reading and the way it's being written, which is A+ writing, if I do say so myself. Ovid kind of slayed that one. I think that the transformation of women into men in these ancient Greek myths is very representative of the enigma that women posed to ancient Greeks. But there are also stories of men becoming women. And a really great example of that is the story of Tiresias. Tiresias was a blind man from Thebes, and one day he struck a pair of snakes mating, which you're not supposed to do. I guess there were these two snakes mating, and he was like, nah. So he, was like, and hit them. This angered Hera, the goddess in charge. So this was not good for him. Hera was so angry that she turned him into a woman. Could be worse. After roaming the earth for 7 years, pretty content in herself, Tiresias came across another pair of mating snakes in the same spot. Really great coincidence. Anyway, she struck them again, and Hera turned her back into a man. And then, because Zeus and Hera were having a fight, because that's all they ever did, because they hate each other, they came down to Tiresias and they were like, hey, you're the only person who has been both a man and a woman. So tell me, is sex better as a man or a woman? It's an age-old question. They really wanted to know. So we do canonically have an answer for whether sex is better for a man or a woman in ancient Greek mythology. Tiresias then dogs all the girls out there and says that sex is far more enjoyable for a woman than it is for a man. And then Hera gets angry again and blinds him. Queen. Despite the mistreatment of women throughout ancient Greece, there is this deep desire to understand them. So I think these stories serve a number of purposes. One, which is the one I've kind of been talking about the most, which is that it's a way for men to understand women so they can perceive femininity from a masculine point of view. But I also think it's a way that people would have understood gender change in antiquity. Because this happens so often in Greek myth, you can assume that this concept was around. Art imitates life. And because our idea of gender and our society and culture is just so drastically different from what it would have been like in ancient Greece, we can't assume that these stories hold any similarity to what we now perceive as being transgender. In ancient Greece, it was just a woman lived as a man or a man lived as a woman. The concept of transgenderism didn't exist like it does now, but it was still present, and we can see that through these stories, that those stories were being told for whatever reason, whether they were to understand the lives of women or whether they were just to explore the lives of transgender individuals in ancient Greece. At the end of the day, we don't know what these stories are like really saying. I mean, they could be completely 100% factual. We don't really know exactly what they represent, but I just think it's so silly when people are like, oh, this transgender thing is just a fad and people are going to get over it. And why have I never heard of a transgender person before 2015? Because you weren't listening. Transgender people exist all throughout history. I've just decided to cover these very few stories today because those are the ones that I know the best. If you know any other stories through mythology or through history of transgender individuals who lived well before our time, then please let me know. Anyway, this was just a really quick little thing. It wasn't as structured as I usually like to be. Trans people have been around for a long time and they're not going to go anywhere. It's just a natural part of life. Gender isn't real. Nothing is real. We're all gonna die. Goodbye. I love you.